The snow fell in sheets, not flakes. It was a curtain dropping on the world, silencing the pines and burying the tracks of anything foolish enough to be moving. Hollis Venn was foolish enough. He leaned against the rough bark of a spruce, the wood cold even through his worn coat, and watched the gray air. He was not tracking. He was waiting. The wind was a low moan through the high branches, a sound he knew better than any human voice. For 10 years, it had been his only real companion. He shifted his weight, the old ache in his hip, a dull throb that beat time with the falling snow. It was a gift from a dead man in a forgotten town, a reminder that every debt is eventually paid, one way or another. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher, the smell of wood smoke and wet wool a familiar comfort. He had built his life on such small comforts. A dry cabin, a full woodpile, a clean rifle. It was not the life he had once imagined. But it was a life. It was quiet, and for a man with a past like his, quiet was a mercy he had not earned. He pushed himself off the tree, his snowshoes sinking with a soft crunch. The silence that followed was absolute. He was a ghost in a white world, and that was how he liked it. He moved through the trees with a practiced economy, his steps measured, his breath a controlled plume of white. He had learned this patience the hard way in a different life, when patience meant the difference between a full belly and an empty one, between living and dying. Now it just meant solitude. He rounded a granite outcrop, its face plastered with snow like a crude plaster cast, and saw the print. It was small, neat, the mark of a lighter frame, not a bear, not a wolf. Human. He crouched, his gloved fingers hovering over the indentation. The edges were still sharp, the snow within it barely disturbed. Recent. He had not seen another human track in this part of the forest for 3 years. The last had been a lost trapper, half mad with cold, whom Hollis had led back toward the distant, unseen line of civilization and left with a flask of whiskey and a warning to never return. This track was different. It was deliberate. It was following the game trail that led, eventually, toward his valley, toward his cabin, toward him. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with their white burden. Nothing moved, but he felt it. A pressure in the air, a change in the quality of the silence, the feeling of being watched. He had felt it before, in ambushes and night raids, the prickle on the back of the neck that screamed of a rifle being leveled, of a finger tightening on a trigger. He looked back at the print. It was a single track, a scout's track. Someone testing the ground, moving with a hunter's stealth. He knew that stealth. He had taught it. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass under the skin, rose in his mind. A small hand in his, a girl's face turned up to him, her eyes wide, as he showed her how to read the story the forest floor told, how to walk without a sound, how to see without being seen. He shook his head, the memory dissolving like smoke. That was another life. That girl was gone, lost to the fire and the screaming and the past he had tried to bury under a decade of snow. He turned his back on the track and continued his way, but his posture had changed. He was no longer a man moving through his domain. He was prey. She watched him from the ridge, the rifle a cold, familiar weight in her hands. The stock was smooth against her cheek, a dark, oiled wood that felt more like a part of her than her own bones. It was not the rifle he had given her. That one had been small, a child's gun, its stock broken in the chaos of that night. She had kept the splintered wood for a long time, a relic of a different kind of breaking. This rifle was her own. Earned, paid for, sighted by her own eye. She watched him move through the trees below, a dark shape against the overwhelming white. He walked the same way, that rolling gait that favored his left hip, a slight, almost imperceptible limp that she could read like a line of scripture. He was older. His hair, what she could see of it under his hat, was more gray than she remembered. But he was the same man, the same broad shoulders, the same way of holding his head, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She let out a slow, cold breath, the vapor snatched away by the wind. She had been tracking him for 2 days, ever since the first heavy snow had given her the cover she needed. She had found the cabin easily enough. It was just as the whispers had said. Tucked away in a high valley, miles from anything, a curl of smoke its only betrayal. She had circled it for a day, watching, learning his routines. The way he chopped wood in the morning, the way he checked his snares at dusk, the way he stood on the porch for a long time after the sun went down, looking out at the darkness as if expecting a visitor. Well, the visitor was here. She shifted, the necklace of spent cartridges clicking softly against the rough wool of her coat. Each one was a story, a ghost, a piece of the debt he owed. She had gathered them from the ashes of her home, dug them out of the charred timbers of the barn, his gang's bullets, a rosary of vengeance. Her finger rested on the trigger guard, the metal biting with cold. She had the shot. It was a long one, but she could make it. He had taught her how to account for wind, for the drop of the bullet over distance. He had taught her everything. Everything except why he had ridden with them in the first place. Everything except why he had killed her father. She watched him disappear into a thicket of young firs. The shot was there, clean and simple. Justice, an ending. But it was too easy. An animal's death. He deserved more. He deserved to see her face. He deserved to hear her say the name. Uncle. The word was a stone in her mouth. She lowered the rifle, the tension in her shoulders easing but not leaving. Not yet. She would not kill him from a distance. She would not be a shadow on a ridge. She would be the consequence that walked through his front door. She would stand on the floorboards he had built, breathe the air he warmed with his fire, and look him in the eye as she balanced the scales. She pulled her collar tight around her neck and began the slow, careful descent from the ridge, her steps as silent as the falling snow. Hollis knew she was there. He didn't know how he knew, but it was a certainty that had settled deep in his bones, colder than the winter air. He had spent the day fortifying his life, not the cabin. No amount of barred windows or reinforced doors could stop what was coming. He had fortified himself. He sharpened his axe until the edge was a razor gleam. He stacked his firewood with a geometric precision, each log a prayer for warmth against a coming chill. He cleaned his rifle, the scent of oil and solvent filling the small cabin, a smell that brought back a cascade of unwanted memories. The camaraderie of a campfire, the low laughter of men who lived by the gun, the weight of a shared bloody purpose. He had been one of them, the best of them. Hollis Venn, the man who could read a trail in the dark, the man who never missed, the man who had shown a little girl how to aim true, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. He pushed the cleaning rod through the barrel one last time, the patch coming out clean. He assembled the rifle with a practiced speed, his hands moving without thought. But he did not load it. He placed it on its rack above the fireplace, beside the splintered stock of a child's rifle. He had found it in the ashes the day after, the only thing he had taken from the ruin of his own making. A penance, a reminder. He looked at the broken wood, the grain dark with soot. He had given it to her on her 10th birthday. He had promised to teach her how to use it, to hunt with him, to be self-sufficient. A promise made in a time of peace, a time before the greed had curdled in the hearts of his companions, before the raid had been planned, before the world had burned. He had argued against it. He had told them the settlement was poor, that there was nothing to gain but blood. They had laughed at him, called him soft, and in the end, he had ridden with them. Because that is what you did. You rode with your own, until you couldn't anymore. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. The fire crackled in the hearth, a warm, living thing in the heart of the cabin. Outside, the world was dying, smothered in white, and she was out there in it. He could feel her presence like a storm front moving in, the pressure dropping, the air growing thin. He did not know for sure that it was her. But who else could it be? Who else was left with a claim on his soul? Who else would hunt him with such patient, cold fury? He walked to the window and looked out. The snow was still falling, a relentless, silent siege. He saw no movement, no sign, but she was there, a ghost from his past, come to collect. And the worst part, the part that twisted in his gut like a knife, was that he knew he deserved it. He had spared her life, yes, in the firelight, with her father's body cooling on the floorboards and the smell of kerosene thick in the air. He had stood between her and the others. He had raised his own gun to men he called brothers and told them to leave the girl. One life he had bought her. But what a life it must have been. An orphan in a world of ash and memory. And he, the man who had saved her, was also the man who had destroyed everything she had ever known. Mercy. He had thought it an act of mercy. Now, watching the snow bury the world, he knew it had been a cruelty. He had not saved her. He had only postponed her death, and in doing so, had created his own executioner. He turned from the window, the warmth of the fire feeling like a lie. There was no warmth left in the world for him, only the cold and the waiting. Kasha made her camp in a hollow, carved out by the roots of a fallen giant. The snow was deep here, insulating, and the overhang of the root ball offered some protection from the endless fall. She did not build a fire. A fire was a beacon. A fire was a comfort, and she had no room for comfort. She ate jerky, the dried meat tough and salty, and drank melted snow from her canteen. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that seeped into her bones, but she was used to it. Cold was her element. It sharpened the senses, it kept the mind clear. Warmth made you soft. Warmth was the memory of a hearth, of a hand on her shoulder, of a voice telling her a story before sleep. Warmth was a betrayal. She checked her rifle for the 10th time, wiping away the clinging snow from the barrel, making sure the action was clean. She knew it was. It was a ritual. A way to focus her mind, to keep the memories at bay. But they came anyway. They always came in the dark. The smell of burning pine. The sound of her mother's scream, cut short. The sight of her father, standing in the doorway, a pitchfork in his hands, trying to defend his home against a half-dozen rifles. And Hollis. Uncle Hollis, standing behind the others, his face a mask in the flickering firelight. He had not fired. She remembered that. He had not been one of the ones to shoot her father, but he had been there. He had ridden with them. He had watched. And then, later, when it was all over, when the house was an inferno and the world was ending, he had been the one to find her. Hiding in the root cellar, trembling in the dark, the broken stock of her little rifle clutched in her hands. He had come down the steps, his shadow huge and terrifying. He had knelt before her, and for a moment she thought he was going to kill her too. But he had just looked at her, and his face, the face she had loved, was shattered. It was the face of a man looking into his own grave. "Go," he had whispered, his voice hoarse. "Run. Don't look back." And then he had stood and blocked the cellar entrance as the others came looking, their voices hungry for more death. She had run. She had scrambled out the small cellar window and fled into the night, the sounds of his arguing with his own men fading behind her. She did not look back. She had obeyed him then. She would not obey him now. She lay back against the frozen earth, the rifle across her chest. She did not sleep. She watched the snow fall and thought of the fire he had lit. Every year, on the anniversary of the raid. She had found it by accident 5 years ago, drawn by a flicker of light in the high country. She had crept close and watched him from the darkness. He built a small, respectful fire on the ruins of her home. He just sat there, from dusk till dawn, a solitary vigil in the cold. He never knew she was there, a stone's throw away, her own rifle in her hands, her heart a knot of ice and fire. What was it? Atonement? Guilt? Or just a man visiting a grave he had dug himself? It didn't matter. It changed nothing. A fire could not bring back the dead. A fire could not unburn a house. It was an empty gesture, a performance for an audience of ghosts, and she was the only ghost who could still pull a trigger. She closed her eyes, but the image of the fire was burned onto the inside of her lids. This year, the anniversary was in 2 days. This year, the vigil would be different. This year, the fire would have 2 witnesses, and only one would walk away. The deer appeared at dawn. Hollis saw it first, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. It was a young buck, its coat thick against the cold, its antlers small and dark against the snow. It moved with a delicate grace, testing the air, its breath misting around its black nose. Hollis froze, his hand on the cabin door. He had seen this deer before, or one like it. It was not afraid of his scent, not yet. It had come down from the high ridges, driven by the heavy snow, seeking the shelter of the valley. He watched it dip its head, nibbling at the exposed shoots of a willow bush. He needed the meat. The winter was long, and his stores were not endless. His rifle was on the rack, unloaded. It would be an easy shot. A shot he had taught her how to make. The heart shot, quick and clean. A merciful death. He remembered teaching her, her small shoulder tucked into his, the weight of the rifle too much for her, his hand steadying the barrel. "You only shoot what you mean to eat," he had told her, "and you kill it clean. You owe the animal that respect." She had nodded, her face serious, her eyes fixed on the target, a pine cone balanced on a distant stump. She had missed the first 3 shots, but the 4th had been true. He remembered the look on her face, the fierce pride, the dawning understanding of her own power. He had been proud of her. He had loved her like she was his own blood. A love that now felt like a curse. The buck raised its head, its ears swiveling, and looked directly at the cabin. It looked directly at him. Its eyes were dark, liquid, and held no judgment. It was just an animal, living its life, unaware of the complex webs of sin and retribution that men wove for themselves. He could kill it. He should kill it. It was survival. But he couldn't. He could not bring himself to spill any more blood in this valley. Not now. Not with her out there, watching. To kill the deer would be a profanity. It would be a betrayal of the one clean thing he had ever taught her. He slowly, carefully, let his hand fall from the door. He took a step back, into the shadows of the cabin. The deer watched him for a long moment. Then, satisfied that the threat had passed, it returned to its foraging. From her hiding place in the rocks above the clearing, Kasha watched the scene unfold. She had seen the deer first, and her rifle had come up as if by instinct. The crosshairs settled on its shoulder, right where he had taught her. A breath held, a slow squeeze. She could almost hear his voice in her ear, a low murmur of instruction. But then she saw him. He appeared in the doorway of the cabin, a dark silhouette against the warm light within. He saw the deer. He froze. She held her breath, her finger tense on the trigger. But she was not aiming at the deer anymore. The rifle was pointed at the man in the doorway. Here it was, the perfect moment. He was distracted. He was vulnerable. A shot now would be the end of it. The end of the waiting, the end of the cold, the end of the ache that had been her constant companion for 10 years. But he did not move toward his rifle. He did not raise a hand. He simply watched the animal. And then, he stepped back. He retreated into the shadows, leaving the deer in peace. Kasha lowered her rifle, a tremor running through her arms. She did not understand. He was a hunter. He was a survivor. He needed the meat. Why would he let it go? Was it a trick? Was he trying to draw her out? No. His movements had been genuine. There was a weariness in the way he had stepped back, a resignation. It was not the act of a man laying a trap. It was the act of a man who was done with killing. A bitter laugh caught in her throat. Him? Done with killing? The man who had ridden with the butchers of Juniper Creek? The man whose hands were stained with the blood of her family? The idea was obscene, and yet she had seen it. He had chosen not to shoot, the same way she had. She looked from the cabin to the deer, which was now moving slowly across the clearing, and felt a strange, unwelcome connection to the man in the house. They had both seen the deer. They had both held its life in their hands, and they had both chosen mercy. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She had not come here for mercy. She had come for justice. She had come for payment. The deer disappeared into the trees, leaving the clearing empty again. The moment was gone. She was left with the same cold, the same rifle, and a new, unsettling question. What did it mean that they had both refused to shoot the deer? Did it mean they were the same? The thought was a violation. She was nothing like him. She was the consequence. She was the reckoning. The deer was just an animal. It meant nothing. She told herself that over and over, a litany against the doubt that was beginning to creep in, cold and insidious as the frost. It meant nothing. He was still the man who had destroyed her world, and she was still the girl who would make him answer for it. She settled back into her position, her resolve hardening into a sharp, brittle thing. The deer was a distraction. The real hunt was still on. The day of the anniversary dawned gray and heavy. The snow had stopped, and a profound, ringing silence had fallen over the forest. Hollis spent the morning in a state of quiet ritual. He did not chop wood. He did not check his snares. He sat at his small table and repaired a leather strap on one of his snowshoes, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. He was waiting for nightfall. He was waiting for the time of the fire. The day crawled by, each second stretched thin. He ate a little, but the food had no taste. He looked at his rifle on the wall, its dark metal and wood, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn logs of the cabin. He had been a man of violence. He had lived by the gun and the swift, brutal solutions it offered. He had believed in strength, in the power to take what you wanted, to protect what was yours. But what had it brought him? A dead family, not his own, but one he had loved. A lifetime of exile, a legacy of ash. He had thought sparing her was an act of strength, a moment of defiance against the bloodlust of his own gang, but it was weakness. He had been too weak to stop the raid and too weak to face the consequences. He had run. He had hidden himself in the mountains, hoping the past would die of neglect. But the past did not die. It just waited. It grew strong in the cold and the dark, biding its time. And now it was here. Now it had a face and a name and a rifle of its own. When dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, he stood. He pulled on his heavy coat, his gloves, his hat. He took a small bundle of kindling and a flask of kerosene. He did not take his rifle. He left it on the wall, a silent testament to a life he was trying to leave behind. He stepped out of the cabin and into the twilight. The air was frigid, so cold it felt sharp in his lungs. He walked with his head down, his snowshoes making a steady, rhythmic crunch in the deep powder. He did not look toward the ridges. He did not scan the trees for movement. He knew she was watching. Let her watch. This was not for her. This was for him. This was for them, the ones who could not watch. He walked for nearly an hour, following a path he knew by heart, a path he walked only once a year. He came to a clearing, a place where the trees grew back from a wide open space, In the center of the clearing was a scar, a dark, rectangular shape on the landscape, hidden under the snow, the foundation of a house. A few charred timbers still jutted from the ground like broken teeth. This was the place. He knelt in the snow, in the exact spot where the hearth had once been. He brushed the snow away with his gloved hands, revealing the blackened stones. He laid his kindling carefully, stacking the small, dry sticks in a small pyramid. He uncorked the flask and sprinkled a little kerosene on the wood. He took a match from a waterproof case, struck it on the rough stone of the old hearth, and touched it to the kindling. The flame caught with a whoosh, a small, bright flower of orange in the deepening blue of the evening. He sat back on his heels and watched it grow. The fire ate the kindling, then the larger pieces of wood he had brought and laid nearby. It grew into a modest, respectable blaze, a beacon of warmth in the vast, freezing emptiness. He did not feed it into a bonfire. It was not a celebration. It was a vigil. He sat in the snow and stared into the flames and let the memories come. The memory of a man's laughter, a deep, booming sound that filled a room. The memory of a woman's smile, gentle and kind. The memory of a little girl, her pigtails flying as she ran to greet him, her voice crying out that single, happy word. "Uncle!" The word was a spear in his heart. He had been their friend, their protector, and their destroyer. He sat there as the stars came out, tiny, cold pinpricks of light in the black sky. The fire crackled and hissed, the only sound in the world. He did not know how long he sat there. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the fire, and the cold, and the weight of what he had done. He was a man sitting at a grave he had dug with his own hands, and he was waiting for the judgment of the ghost he had created. Kasha watched him from the tree line. She had followed him from the cabin, a silent shadow moving through the woods. She knew where he was going. She had known he would come here tonight. She watched him build the fire, her body rigid, her breath held tight in her chest. Every movement he made was a torment. The way he knelt on the ground where her kitchen used to be. The way he lit the fire on the hearth where her mother had cooked their meals. It was a desecration, a performance of grief on the stage of his own crime. Her hand was on her rifle, her knuckles white. She could shoot him now. Shoot him right here, in the ashes of her life. Let his blood soak into the ground he had stained with the blood of her family. It would be poetry. It would be justice. But she did not raise the rifle. She watched him sit there, a lonely, broken figure silhouetted against the flames. His head was bowed. He did not move. He just stared into the fire. She saw his shoulders shake once, a single, convulsive tremor. Was he crying? The thought was so alien, so impossible, that it stopped her cold. Hollis Venn, the raider, the killer, crying. She wanted to hate him for it. She wanted to see it as weakness, as another lie, but she could not. In that single, unguarded moment, she saw not the monster of her nightmares, but the man she remembered. The man who had taught her to fish, who had carved her a wooden horse, who had held her when she fell and scraped her knee. The man she had loved, the man she had called uncle. The conflict inside her was a physical thing, a tearing, a rending. The girl who had loved him and the woman who had come to kill him were at war within her skin. She had come here for a simple, clean act of vengeance. But nothing about this was simple. Nothing was clean. It was a tangled, ugly mess of love and betrayal, of memory and grief. She watched him for what felt like hours, the fire slowly dying down, the cold creeping back into the clearing. He was a statue of remorse, a monument to a past that could never be undone. Killing him now would be an execution. It would be an act of mercy, releasing him from the prison of his own memory. And she was not here to give him mercy. He had had his chance at mercy 10 years ago, and he had spent it on her. Now it was her turn. She would not kill him tonight. She would not give him the peace of a quick death. She would let him live. She would let him sit by his dying fire in the ruins of his own making, and she would let him freeze in the knowledge that she was here, that she was watching, and that she was not going away. She melted back into the trees, a ghost leaving a ghost to his vigil. The hunt was not over. It had just entered a new, more terrible phase. She would not just take his life, she would take his peace. She would take his solitude. She would become the ghost that haunted him, not in his memory, but in his waking life. And when he was well and truly broken, when he had paid in fear and sleepless nights, then she would come for the final payment. Hollis knew the moment she left. The pressure in the air changed. The feeling of being watched was gone. He was alone again, truly alone, with just the dying embers and the ghosts. He did not look up. He did not turn to where he knew she had been standing. He just sat there, the cold seeping into him, a welcome numbness. She had not killed him. He had offered her the perfect opportunity. His back was turned. He was unarmed. He was lost in his own private hell. It would have been easy, but she had let him live. Why? The question was a new kind of torture. Had she pitied him? The thought was unbearable. Had she decided he was not worth the bullet? Or was it something else? Something colder? Something more calculating? He looked at the glowing embers, the last remnants of his fire. He had come here seeking... what? Forgiveness? Absolution? He knew he would find neither. He came here to remember, to force himself to look at the wreckage of his life. But tonight was different. Tonight, the past had looked back. She was not the little girl he had saved. She was a woman, a hunter, forged in the fires he had set, and she was hunting him with a patience and a skill that he himself had taught her. She was his legacy, his sin made flesh and given a rifle. He finally stood, his limbs stiff with cold. He did not look back at the clearing. There was nothing there for him anymore. He started the long walk back to his cabin, his mind a turmoil of confusion and a new, creeping fear. He had been prepared to die. He had accepted it as the price for his crimes. But living? Living with her out there, a shadow in the trees, her judgment held in reserve. That was a punishment he had never imagined. It was a hell of his own making, and she was its architect. He reached his cabin as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. He opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of wood smoke and solitude greeting him. But it was different now. It was not a sanctuary. It was a cage. He walked to the fireplace and looked at the two rifles on the rack. His, clean and ready, and hers, the broken one, the symbol of his failure. He reached up and took down the splintered stock. He held it in his hands, the wood smooth and worn. He had thought he was sparing her, but he had only been sparing himself. He had been a coward. He had run from the consequences, and now, 10 years later, they had found him. He put the broken stock back on the rack and turned to face the room. The cabin felt small, confining. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was a weight. The silence was listening. And out there, in the snow and the cold, she was listening too. The next few days were a torment. Hollis lived in a state of heightened awareness. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, a potential threat. He did not see her. He found no tracks near the cabin. But he knew she was there. She was a constant presence, a pressure on the edge of his senses. He did his chores, he maintained his life, but it was all a performance. He was an actor on a stage, and he knew his audience was watching, silent and critical. He started talking to himself, his voice a rough, unused thing in the quiet cabin. He would narrate his actions, as if to justify them to his unseen judge. "Chopping the wood now," he would mutter, the axe biting deep. "Need to keep the fire going. It's a cold winter." He would leave a portion of his food on a stump at the edge of the clearing each night. A piece of bread, a strip of salted meat, an offering, a plea. He did not know if she took it. In the morning, it was always gone, eaten by a fox, a marten, or by her. He preferred to think it was her. It felt like a conversation of a sort, a communion of ghosts. He stopped sleeping. He would lie in his bunk, his eyes wide open in the dark, listening. He would hear the cabin creak and settle, the wind moaning in the chimney. And in the silence between the sounds, he would imagine he heard her breathing, just outside the walls. He was slowly coming apart. The solitude he had cultivated for a decade had become a prison of paranoia. He had been the hunter for so long, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be the hunted. She was teaching him again. She was stripping away his calluses, his defenses, leaving his nerves raw and exposed. She was not just coming for his life, she was deconstructing his soul. Kasha watched it all. She watched him leave the food. She never touched it. Let the animals have it. She was not an animal to be placated with scraps. She watched him grow gaunt, the skin tightening over his cheekbones. She saw the dark circles under his eyes. She saw the way he would stop in the middle of a task and stare off into the trees, his face a mask of dread. She was winning. She was breaking him without firing a single shot. She had thought this would bring her satisfaction, a cold, clean pleasure in seeing him suffer as she had suffered. But it did not. It was a hollow, bitter victory. Each day, as she watched him unravel, a piece of herself unraveled with it. The image of the man she was destroying was superimposed over the image of the man she had loved, and she could not separate the two. She remembered a winter when she was 8, when a fever had almost taken her. He had sat by her bed for 3 days, bathing her face with cool water, forcing broth between her lips, telling her stories of the stars until she fell into a restless sleep. He had saved her then, too. Was this how she repaid him? By driving him mad before she killed him? The thought was a poison. It seeped into her, turning her resolve to a brittle, fragile thing. She had been so sure of her purpose. Her quest for vengeance had been the single, burning star that had guided her through the dark years. Now, with her target in her sights, the star was flickering. The line between justice and cruelty, between retribution and revenge, was blurring. She was becoming the monster she had set out to destroy. One afternoon, she watched him as he stood by the stream that ran through the valley. He was just standing there, staring into the icy water, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He looked old. He looked broken. And in that moment, she did not see the raider. She did not see the killer. She saw her uncle, and she felt a pang of something she had not allowed herself to feel for 10 years. A pang of love. It was a terrible, agonizing thing. It was a betrayal of her father, of her mother, of the life that had been stolen from her. She raised the rifle, the stock cold against her cheek. She could end it now, for both of them. One shot, and it would all be over. The hunting, the waiting, the remembering. She could set them both free. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The crosshairs were steady on the back of his head. He would never even know it was coming. A clean kill, a merciful death. She held the breath, the world narrowing to the man and the rifle and the space between them. But she could not do it. Her finger would not obey. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped her eye and rolled down her cold cheek. It froze almost instantly. She lowered the rifle, her body shaking with a silent, racking sob. She was lost. She had come here to find justice, but she had only found more pain. She had come here to be the hand of fate, but she was just a girl with a rifle and a broken heart, hunting a man she could not bring herself to kill. The confrontation came on a morning so bright and cold it seemed the world was made of glass. Hollis was splitting logs when he felt the change. The silence behind him was different. It was not the empty silence of the forest. It was a full, weighted silence, the silence of a held breath. He stopped, the axe held halfway through its swing. He did not turn around. He did not have to. He knew. "Keisha," he said. His voice was a raw croak. He had not said her name aloud in 10 years. It felt like breaking something. The silence stretched. Then a voice, low and cold as the winter wind. "Uncle." The word was not a greeting. It was an indictment. It was a curse. It held 10 years of cold and hunger and rage. He slowly lowered the axe and placed it on the chopping block. He turned. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, not 20 yards away. She held the rifle with a familiarity that made his heart ache. It was not pointed at him, but held at a ready position across her chest. She was thinner than he remembered, all sharp angles and hard lines, but her eyes were the same, dark and deep, and filled with a pain that he had put there. On her chest, glinting in the bright sun, was the necklace, the bullets he had left behind in the ash, a rosary of his sins. "You're looking old," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Winter's hard," he replied, his own voice rough. "You taught me how to survive it." "I taught you many things," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, and her voice was suddenly sharp, a shard of ice. "You taught me how to track, how to shoot, how to be quiet. You forgot to teach me why my father had to die." The question hung in the frozen air between them. The question he had been running from for a decade. The question he had no answer for. Not one that would satisfy her. Not one that would satisfy himself. "There was no reason," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was greed, stupidity. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" she repeated, and a terrible, bitter smile touched her lips. "You call the murder of my family a mistake?" "There's no word for what it was," he said, his eyes pleading with her. "There's no word big enough to cover it." He took a step toward her, his hands open, empty. A gesture of peace. A gesture of surrender. The rifle came up in a single, fluid motion. The muzzle was a black, unblinking eye, pointed directly at his heart. He stopped. "Don't," she warned, her voice trembling with the effort of control. "Don't come any closer." He stood still, his heart a heavy, slow drum in his chest. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The end of the line. He looked at her face, at the girl he had loved, the woman she had become. He saw the pain, the rage, the confusion, and he knew what he had to do. He had taught her never to hesitate, never to give your enemy an opening. He stood there, open, vulnerable, and did not raise a hand to defend himself. He would not make her kill a man who was fighting back. He would not make her into the thing he had been. He would give her the one thing he had left to give, a clean shot, a final, terrible act of love. "Do it," he said, his voice soft but clear in the still air. "It's your right. It's the justice you came for. End it, Kasha, please." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between the past and the present. He saw the tremor in her hands, the slight waver of the rifle barrel. He had taught her to be strong. He prayed she was strong enough to do this. He prayed she was strong enough not to. He closed his eyes, ready for the impact, for the fire, for the final silence. He heard the explosion of the shot, a deafening crack that shattered the glass-like morning. He flinched but felt no pain. He opened his eyes. He was still standing. The snow beside him, a foot from his boot, was kicked up in a black spray. She had missed. No. She hadn't missed. She had chosen. He looked at her. Her face was a mask of anguish, tears streaming down her cheeks, freezing in the bitter air. The rifle was lowered, pointing at the ground. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with the force of her decision. She had faced the ghost of her past, and she had refused to become him. She looked at him, her eyes burning with a fire that was not just hatred anymore. It was something far more complex, far more terrible. It was the agony of a love that could not be extinguished, a love twisted and broken by betrayal. She shot the snow beside him and said, "Next winter, you answer."